So today in the lab we're going to be working on a mystery, and that mystery involves these two external floppy drives here for the Commodore Amiga. Now before you I have three types of drives, and these three types of external drives here represent the major models of external drives that were produced by Commodore for its Amiga line of computers during its runtime. Now the first of these here is this A1010, and I have two of these. These were the first, to my understanding, and they match the case stylings of the Amiga 1000. Then we have this A1011 here, and this matches the case stylings of the Amiga 500 and was a bit later. This also came in a black color to match the CD-TV model computer that they had, and I think there may have been a variant that was in a gray color for the CD32, but that might just be concept art. I'm not 100% sure. Lastly, down here at the bottom, we have the A1020, and this is a 5 1/4 inch drive. And it's really not meant for native Amiga storage, but rather to enable interoperability with IBM PCs. Now this drive is basically a Commodore 1571 drive with some Amiga badging on it. And so it doesn't really match the case styles of the Amiga 1000 or any Amiga, because it's meant to match the case styles of the Commodore 128. Now looking on the back of the A1010, we see that there's a daisy chain port here. And these were meant to be daisy chained together, and the Amiga 1000, for example, could support up to 3 drives externally daisy chained. If we look on the back of the A1011, which is the later drive, we can see that daisy chain port is removed. And that's just because by the time this later drive was released, daisy chaining together multiple floppy drives was really not as desirable. You now had things like external hard drives that were coming down in price, and in 1985 it may have been very useful and very productive to have 4 total floppy drives, which was the maximum that the Amiga 1000 could support. But by the time we get into the late 80s and early 90s, it was much better to spend your money on maybe 1 external floppy drive and a hard drive. Now looking at the back of the A1020, which is the 5 1/4 inch drive, we'll not only see that pass-through, but also a power cable here. And that's because this unit required external power in order to be able to run. That is of course missing on the A1010 because the power needed was included in the pins on the normal floppy cable. I suspect that the 5 1/4 inch drive needed external power because of the larger power requirement for this drive. So if you wanted to daisy chain these together, it'd be pretty straightforward. The first external drive would plug into your Amiga. The second external drive would plug into the first, and then the third would plug into the second. So I have these 2 drives hooked up to my Amiga 2000, and I've got them labeled A and B. And I've got 2 discs here, which is basically disc 1 and disc 2 of the Amiga C compiler from Lattice. And I have 4 drives total in this Amiga 2000. So there's 2 internal and 2 external, which means this should be DF2 and this should be DF3. Now if I put a disc in here, we see it activates and it starts to do stuff. Same thing if I put one here in A. And if I look at show config, I can see DF2 and DF3 with my 2 Lattice discs here. And of course the icons also show up on the workbench. Nice, great big Lattice C compiler icons for these disks. Now if I shut down my Amiga, and you should always shut down your Amiga before adding external disk drives or removing them. If I swap these two, So now I have these swapped. So the B drive should be DF2 and the A drive should be DF3. If I put something in the A drive, see, we get nothing at all. And if I put something in the B drive, it starts to read, but it's doing something very odd. And up on the screen it says DF2 unreadable. Also, if I look at my drives here, I now only have 3 floppy drives. So now I have the other drive disconnected and just this one. Insert in a disk. And it acts a lot more normal. And I can see up on my screen here the disk icon, this big lattice book. So clearly there's something going on wrong with this drive, where every drive past it in the chain doesn't register, and when there are other drives connected to this, things don't work right. So why is that? This is the mystery that I'm trying to solve. This drive over here on the right seems to work exactly as I would expect, but this one does not. To get into one of these is relatively straightforward. On the bottom, there are 4 screws, and they're recessed, so you need kind of a long, skinny screwdriver to get in there. Now, once those screws are out, we can remove this top cover, and the front faceplate just falls right out, and we can get our first looks at the inside. Now, the LED is glued generally onto this front faceplate, but fortunately Commodore included a little connector so that we can detach it. With a little help from a spudger, we can push that right out. Now on the inside we have a bunch of screws to keep the drive mechanism in place, and then also this RF shield. And I count 1, 2, 3, 4 here on the bottom, and then another 1, 2, 3, 4 over here on the back. And the idea is you remove all these screws, and then you can take both the drive and this RF shield out. It's a little tricky, and you're not supposed to be able to take the drive out without also taking the RF shield out. So let's get these screws removed and see if we can get this out without too much heartache. Okay, now that I've got all the screws out, we should be able to kind of lift out the drive mechanism and pull it forward such that we can remove the RF shield. And now we can see there's a printed circuit board and a regular floppy connector and a regular power supply connector here. So this is a normal floppy drive in here. There's nothing special about it. My understanding is it's actually usually the same model that's in the Amiga 1000. There were actually more screws holding this in than I counted earlier. There are 2 that mesh up with the drive, and then there's another 2 down here that sandwich between this PCB down here and the actual case. 2 with very short screws that hook into the cable clamp, and then 2 more that hook in where it daisy chains on this port that daisy chains out. Now, since this is a standard floppy drive now. All I need to do to get the floppy drive out is just take out the ribbon cable and the power cable. And there we go. We have our floppy drive removed. And we can see now underneath that there's a little PCB here, and that the cable, the external cable, is directly soldered into the board, although it's hard to see under this jumble of wires. But both this ribbon cable and the power cable are on headers. They're removable, both of them. So now that I've got these disassembled and can start to do some diagnostics, I have this set up and I want to repeat some of my experiments. So I have the one with the pass-through not working, hooked directly to the Amiga, and then to that I have my other A1010 where the pass-through is working. So if I put the disk here into the not working one in this configuration, red light will come on and it'll just do this forever. And then the one that's daisy chained to this, nothing happens at all. It's completely dead. Now if I were to reverse this, both of these would work. Now if I just have this drive hooked up by itself, does a disk change and works. If I flip over to Workbench, I can see the disk is recognized and mounted. Now, interestingly, if I have a different style of external floppy drive attached, in this case an A1011, which is a much later model, this works as I expect. Did the disk change? It's working. But this one, and I'll bring this up here so you can see, nothing. It's dead, right? Now this drive works independently. Now lastly, I have the A1020 hooked up. Now the A1020 is different because it has an external power supply. And in this case, this drive still works. The first drive works. However, the A1020, which should be DF3, does not show up. So it's not seeing it. So that's interesting. So my first thought, and after some reading, sounds like some of the A1010s that were shipped by Commodore didn't have the voltages pass through on the board, right? So they pass through the signal lines but not the voltages. So I have this kind of janky setup here, and I've got one of these paper clips connected to a ground line and one of them to the 5-volt line. And if I turn on my Amiga 2000 and try and look at the voltages between these two, I get nothing, right? 0 on the voltmeter. That should have read plus or minus 5 volts depending on if I got the polarity right here. Now if I switch this over to the 12 volt pin, I should be seeing 12 volts, and again, nothing. Now I've got my one working, set up to the same kind of setup, and so if we measure the voltage across these two pins, I should be seeing 5 volts. And I do. I see here 4.5, almost 5. That's good. Now if I switch this pin down to the 12 volt pin and measure this again, see almost 12 volts. That's good. So this on the working drive is definitely passing through the voltages, but on the non-working one it's not. So that's maybe the first thing that we have to look at is, are there traces or things on the PCB that are not passing those through? So we need to do a little bit more disassembly here. So since we did all the prior disassembly, we should be able to just take out the drive by removing these two cables, right? And we should also be able to remove this ribbon cable here. And eventually I'll get to the power cable. But if we look down here, now there should just be these two screws holding the board in place. And if we remove those, we should be able to take out the PCB and take a look at it. Okay, there we go. So this is the board from the one where the pass-through is working. It is revision A, and the board where this is not working is revision B. So it's a later revision, and that's interesting. I don't know if that means anything, but it's interesting that the one that is not working is a later revision. My understanding was that the ones that didn't have the power on the pass-through, which was my understanding was a mistake, were earlier drives. But the earlier drive here works, and the later drive does not. Now that I have the boards out, it's actually pretty easy to see what's going on. These 4 pins over here, these are for the Berg floppy connector, right? And one of these is 12 volt and one of these is 5 volt. And we can see here from one of those, either 12 or 5, there's a trace that goes here and is then connected to one of the pins on the pass-through port. And the same here is true with the other one, and I believe this is the 5 volt one. So it comes here from the Berg connector up over to here, and then that is on the other side of the board, which we'll flip over here right now, right? That's where that comes out on the other side of the board, and then we can follow this trace, which is the lighter green, all the way down here. And we can see there's a notation here, pin 12, which pin 12 is the 5 volt pin on the pass-through connector, right? So this is the revision A, this is the one that works, right? And we can see those traces. Now, if I take a look at revision B here, right? And it may be kind of hard to see, but see, this is where we were tracing earlier. There's supposed to be a trace that goes from here to pin 12. But see how it's dark green instead of light green? That means there's no trace. So this is literally not connected to pin 12 over here. There's no connection. And then the same is true on the other side here, right? On the other board, we could see from the 12 volt pin here that this trace kind of extended all the way down to the 12 volt pin here, which I believe is pin 23. That trace is missing, right? Right, we can see it here very clearly, going all the way there, but that is missing on the other board. So it looks like, and I'm going to have to do some more research now, but it looks like that Commodore removed the traces for the power pass-through between revision A, which is this revision, and revision B, which is this revision. So it looks like I was under the assumption that this was a mistake, but it looks like it was intentional, because there's no other traces on the board. There's not broken traces or anything like that. Like these were removed, and I don't know why. It's very curious. So after doing a bit of research, I've made the following modifications to this logic board that's not allowing the pass-through. And these are just some pretty simple bodge wires that connect up the power leads for 5 volt and 12 volt up to the appropriate pin on the pass-through connector. This is not my best work soldering wise, but from the research that I've done, this should do the trick and should make this drive function like the other A1010 that I have, which allows a pass-through. Now, I wasn't able to find any references to this in old Commodore documentation, but I was able to find a reference to the opposite kind of procedure, and that was for an A1020, the 5.5-inch floppy drive. So the A1020 is the 5.25-inch drive, and as previously stated, it has a inside power supply with it. It takes power from the mains here, and it has a power supply in the chassis. However, from my research, it's become clear that the power supply in here only powers the drive mechanism. It doesn't power the logic board that is used to connect up to the Amiga. The logic board gets its power from the floppy port. So, in a Commodore Tech manual, there was documentation on how to change this so that the logic board inside of this got its power from the internal power supply rather than from the floppy port. This is kind of backwards of what I just did with my A1010, but it would serve the same goal for this guy. It would allow you to chain an A1010 that didn't have power pass-through to this unit and have both of them function, both of them get power. So after making modifications to the logic board for this drive, I've got it hooked up to my Amiga 2000, and then I've daisy-chained another drive to it. And if I insert discs into both of these, they now both work. Everything works now as expected. And if we go over here to the 2000s screen, I can see both of the two discs inserted. They've been recognized. I can eject them, and they go away. I can pop them back in, and they show back up. And additionally, we're looking at show config here. I can see all four of my drives now. So the two internal ones and the two external ones. So this modification to the logic board works, and I'm glad that it was just that simple. So why did Commodore do this? Why did they originally release an A1010 that allowed you to daisy chain multiple drives together and then remove that functionality, make it not possible by cutting these power leads? So there's no definitive answer, but from my research, I think it has to do with the introduction of the Amiga 500. So the Amiga 1000, the original Amiga, had a pretty substantial power supply in it and was capable of powering multiple external A1010s. There was no concern there. But the Amiga 500 came with a much more anemic power supply, and I'd imagine that there were concerns about it being able to support more than one external drive without problems, and being able to supply sufficient power to all of those external drives. And so again, this is me speculating, but I suspect this was kind of a safety mechanism so that you wouldn't hook up, say, three A1010s to your Amiga 500 and then all of a sudden it not work because they're drawing too much power. And I suspect there wasn't a more elegant solution because by the late 80s, the need to have multiple disk drives had decreased substantially. It was still nice to have two, but having four drives, that got kind of excessive. And by the late 80s, you probably would rather sink your money into getting a hard drive rather than getting a bunch of floppy drives. And I think that the other model that Commodore released, which is the A1011, kind of supports this because it doesn't even have a pass-through port to begin with, right? This is meant to just be one singly connected external drive. There's no chance of daisy chaining them because the port literally is not on the device. I think that's probably about as far as we can go with this mystery. So let's get both of these drives back together so that we can see them in use in their final form. Before reassembling, I've cleaned all of the components, all the plastic case components, and they feel a lot better. They still look a little yellow, could use some retrobrighting, but I'm not too concerned with that at the moment. However, the cable attached to the logic board here still doesn't feel clean, right? It's got that grime of the years on it. And I want to be careful cleaning this because it is physically soldered here to the logic board. This is not a detachable cable. And so to clean this, I'm going to use Windex and some paper towels, which is the first time I've used this in a while. Most of the time, like I say, with these plastic components, with a disassembly, I can actually clean them in the sink with dish detergent and things like that. And we're just with the cable now done and dry, let's get to the reassembly. Pretty straightforward. Bottom plate, and then we've got the bottom RF shield, and then we've got a little piece of metal here to help hold the cable, and then we can pop in the logic board. Now it's a bit tricky to get this seated right, but it should sit just right in there. Now, once you have the logic board in place, there's 2 screws on either side of the logic board that hold the logic board in place. And once I get those 2 screws in, then I will hook it up to a drive and test it. Now, fortunately, Commodore minimized the different types of screws that are used, so most of them are all the same size. There are 2 big long ones here that are used around the connector, and then 2 small ones that are used around where the cable strain relief is. But then for the rest of this operation, we got the same screws everywhere. That makes it very nice and easy to keep track of what you're doing here. It's important not to over tighten any of these screws because you crack the plastic case. Now for the floppy ribbon cable, you always want to have the red wire going towards pin 1. And luckily, at least my drive, which is a Neutronics model, has pin 34 labeled. Pin 1 is harder to see, but so you know the directionality of the cable. And the same is true on the logic board. We can see 1 and 2 labeled pretty clearly. Now this particular logic board has 2 sets of pin headers going opposite directions. I imagine this is to accommodate different kinds of cables and different drives, because there's really not a lot of space in here. Now with this setup, we can test before we screw down anything else. This last part of assembly is a little tricky, right? We want to push the grommet here at the edge down into the cutout in the plastic and have the shielded part of this cable resting in the bottom of this cable strain relief here. But what I've noticed is you can put this in various different orientations, and you want to make sure that the cable is laying as flat as possible across this strain relief. As if we look at the piece that goes on top of this, right, this is going to have to lay flat and mate with this area here. So if you have the orientation of this grommet wrong when you push this back in, this area won't be flat, and you won't be able to put the screws in place here to keep it all together. It may be a little hard to see from this angle, especially with this in the way, but see, this is very flat right here. If we had this grommet in rotated, the cable would stick up, and that's not good. Putting in this top piece is a little tricky because it needs to mate with these fins in the drive, like this. And then it goes over on top of all of this. So we kind of have to do an interesting little dance here where we get the drive connected and then wedge it into place so that everything lines up. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do that successfully on camera. Okay, so I have this cabled up. So now what we kind of want to do is lift this up here and slide it into this back place here. and then layer it all down. And so the wings here, which there are wings on both sides, should go through the little slits in this top RF shield. And then you may have to do some kind of manual manipulation to get everything to fit and to get all the screw holes to line up. It's a little tricky, this design, but once you start putting in screws, it gets easier. So the longest screws that you have go here next to the port in these two screw holes. And I'd recommend you do those first, as that kind of anchors everything in place. From there, I'd start kind of putting screws in a staggered pattern around so that everything kind of gets gradually lined up. The two very small screws, they get put in place here where the cable relief is. But every other screw besides the two we just put in are the same size. Now we can put the front plate on and also connect up the LED here. Now the front plate grabs onto these little rivets here, or whatever you want to call them, and they mate with the holes on these protrusions here so that everything stays in place correctly. It can be a little tricky to get right, but once you get it right, everything just stays into place and it's as it should be. And then lastly, there's these 4 recessed holes down in the bottom, which you really need a narrow screwdriver for. One of those multi-tools will not work for this because it's too thick. Now again, I cannot overemphasize enough that you do not want to over-tighten any of these screws, because if you over-tighten them, they will crack the plastic. So don't do that. Alright, so now that I've got these back together, I've got this one as my final drive, this one directly attached to the Amiga 2000, and then the other one's below here just for kind of set dressing. But this is the one where we made the modification to, and I'm now formatting a floppy disk in both of these drives at the same time. And it's really nice to work on a simple problem that has a definite solution and now a definite end. So thank you all for watching. I hope this was informational, and we'll see you next time.